Hey, good morning, everybody. So glad to be with you for another episode of Leadership Matters. I'm Sean Vanderhoven. I'm here with my good friend Liz Wiseman, and in the background is Austin, who's running point, and Lauren, of course, is joining us
On
remotely with
standby.
on standby, and we can't wait to hear from her. So we are really excited to have, this is part two of this conversation of Leadership Matters, where what we're really trying to do in Leadership Matters is to take on the toughest problems that you all are facing. These leadership challenges, many of them are kind of perennial, and today we're dealing with this really tough challenge of being kind of stuck in the middle from the drive and the vision that senior management has, and as they're pushing down on management to kind of get the results, and then contributors that maybe aren't so sure. As Liz said in our last session, they're kind of thinking from a work perspective, I might not be that into you.
Yeah. I'm just not into you.
I'm just not into you. Yeah. So we're back to this time. Last time we're going to review what we talked about, but we're going to really focus on what can you do if you are struggling with this middle management suite. But before we do, we'd love to hear from all of you. So throw into the chat. Let's get going. We're going to be in chat the entire time, looking to grab the collective intelligence of the group. So if you have ideas, if you have thoughts, please put them in so we can grab those and share those out after the conversation. But to start, go ahead and put into chat what's got your interest. A show, a book, a podcast. Just put into chat, what are you into? What are you interested in right now? What's captured your attention? And while you're putting a few things in, I'll share. Liz, what's got my attention is I'm just amazed at this world of how intelligence is shifting. I've been kind of following thinkers on AI, and the latest from, there's a really good podcast called Beyond the Prompt. I've been following it, and they're just looking at, as we, as we went from human energy, burning calories, to artificial intelligence, to artificial energy, what will it look like to go from intelligence to artificial intelligence, and what will the skills be that leaders will need to develop to get people's best thinking with artificial intelligence? I find it very interesting. That's what's got my attention. How about you?
Well, you just put me into a slight temporary panic when you talked about like burning calories in the old world to artificial intelligence. I'm like, oh, is this a world where I burn even fewer calories, where like I'm not even just sitting and thinking, I'm sitting and not thinking, and so there's no calorie burning? This is a bad world to be in. So
Not that world.
Okay, so I was temporarily thinking about that, but I'll tell you a book that I read recently that has been just really on my mind. It's The Problem with Change, and it's by Ashley, and I want to say Goodwin, but it could be Goodall. I'm sort of temporarily forgetting his last name, and I think it's a really, really insightful piece of work, really well researched about what happens when organizations respond to continual uncertainty and ambiguity in the environment by a lot of change, organizational change, strategy change. And we think, oh, that's agile, that's nimble, that's good, that's responsive. But he lays out this case for what it does to our souls, like what it does to the human psyche, and how deeply disruptive it is to the way we work, the way we think, the way we thrive, the way teams thrive, the way communities get built. And he really makes a case for change can be an extraordinary problem, and that maybe staying the course has some advantages. So that's really a nice counterintuitive whack on the side of the head.
Yeah, that is nice. That's definitely not the stance that we're used to hearing, which is be adaptable, be good at change.
Right. Reorganize, rethink, disrupt.
Yeah.
He really takes on disruption as like disruption is disruptive to our beings.
Interesting. Okay, what do we got? I saw some folks, Helen, thanks, interested in coaching classes, interested in giving and receiving effective feedback. Thanks, Carolyn. Getting ready for the school year. Lauren, the problem with change and the essential nature of human. Thanks for that. That was
She's backing me up on that.
Backing you up. Thanks for that. Brenda says, don't believe everything you think. This sounds like an interesting book. Well, thanks for that. We are excited to dive right into this conversation. So before we do, if any of you missed the previous conversation, let's just do a quick review on the challenges that we took on during the last session. So for those of you that are new to Leadership Matters, we submit a request for problems that leaders are grappling with that we can take on. And we looked through to see what are the themes. And as we looked at several months of data, there was this theme of this kind of, middle management squeeze on how do you deal with the pressure coming from both sides. And so we took on two challenges that we started with, and Liz will take us through, this perspective taking that we did last session just briefly. But here's challenge number one. This challenge number one is I have a team of younger employees who want to do big things in their careers, but I can see that they aren't willing to do what it takes to win in our company. How do I approach this situation? So this was challenge one. We then looked at this from the other perspective. The second challenge that we talked about was, I'm a middle manager and I'm struggling to motivate and engage my younger team members to keep the production schedule that senior management is demanding. How do I talk with my SVP about this without looking like I'm trying to avoid responsibility? So Liz, I'm going to pass it to you. Let's kind of recap what we talked about.
Yeah. So first episode on this, and this is a great problem for Leadership Matters, because like the great problems for us to take on are ones that make us nervous, where I come in going, I don't have all the answers for that. So this has been a fun one for us. We spent the last episode trying to unpack this and understand what is going on and what are the various perspectives on this. We talked about the situation, and Lauren did a great job laying out kind of what's happening in the workplace. And, to sum that up is, when we look at that, people as they're entering the workforce seem to have a lot less confidence in the concept of work, and they're less excited about it in many cases. And people are redefining their relationship to work. We're seeing a multiplicity of ways that people are defining a great work life, that this kind of one size fits all, which is I start a career, I work for a big company, like that is fracturing. People are less excited about it, and people aren't necessarily thriving right now in this model.
There was a really interesting stat about this generation just coming in. It was called NEETs. It was.
Yes, there are some really interesting data points. If I get them wrong, I'm sure Lauren will be on it and fix this. There's a couple points about like people's orientation to work. One was like 40% of people coming into the workforce don't want a full-time job, like a traditional 9-to-5 job. That's stunning.
Yeah.
And then there was a second one that stopped me in my tracks when I first read it, is that 23% of people between the ages of 15 and 24 aren't engaged in the workplace or workplace preparatory activities.
Yeah, and this was neither employed or engaged
in education or training.
Yeah, employed, engaged in education, or in training. NEET.
They're not in the pipeline.
Yeah.
To enter the workforce. That's 23%. So you think about 23% of the eligible workforce not being engaged in those activities, but you also have to think of the spillover effect of this, of other people are seeing their friends like, oh, I didn't realize I could opt out of this. So there's that. There's another statistic that Lauren provided, is that I think it was 55% of people in that same age range between 15 and 24 are dealing with an active diagnosis and treatment plan on mental illness or mental health issues. And so people are
54%.
55%.
It's a stunning number.
And so and I don't know what the causality is on this, if that's causing people to redefine their relationship to work, or that in this redefinition of our approach to work, it's causing some of this disconnection. So I don't have enough expertise on to know which direction the causality is going, but we are now managing a workforce where people don't necessarily want to play by the rules of the game as the rules of, the game of work have been played, and people who are feeling like perhaps work is injurious to them and maybe wanting to back away. And we talked about the fact that in this, like, managers are very logically stressed, feeling like they're left holding the bag. They're in this middle management squeeze. I can't meet the increasing demands from above me, and I'm working with a commitment gap. And as I thought about this, then the more I think about it, the more I feel like it's that situation when you feel like you can't make ends meet.
Mhm.
There's just not enough to go around. And so managers are operating in this commitment gap. And also, I think in many ways, we're leading in this age of disconnect, where people are more and more disconnected from work, from the workplace, from their work team, um, physically disconnected. As we know, the remote work in the pandemic has aided some of that, but also disconnected emotionally, maybe more than in the past, and disconnected socially. Like, I don't know, like my work people, my work homies, like I feel less connected
Mhm.
to them. And so, like, how do we lead in this environment? We talked about what this looks like from each perspective. We spent a fair bit of time of what it feels like to be in the middle, where it's overwhelming. You feel like I just, I don't have, I can't make ends meet. I can't close this gap. And then feeling like you're going to look to senior leaders like you're not taking responsibility, or maybe potentially be blamed for it. Now, if you were with us last time, you remember I spent a fair bit of time whinging and complaining about the bike incident in Vietnam, where, I'm got disconnected from our little family Peloton back. But what I didn't really tell you is why I was resentful about that.
So if you missed it, just watch the last episode to get the full kind of story here.
Yeah. Yeah. Falling behind, and I'm trying to like keep my youngest son alive in the back of the pack. We end up getting lost and separated from group. None of that was what left me with this bad taste. It was that when we were finally reunited with the rest of our family and our guide, we got blamed.
Mhm.
They were like, where did you guys go? And why didn't you keep up? And why didn't you turn when we turned? And I'm like,
Mm.
and I think a lot of managers
Yeah.
are, and I'm going to let this go where I'm not going to bring up the biking incident again. But I think a lot of managers feel like they're left holding the bag and blamed. We talked about what this looks like from the perspective of senior leaders who aren't necessarily demanding more because they're ogres or they're trying to like squeeze profit. It's that they're trying to create a winning scenario, and they know that they've got to create a cycle of success. And we know this, that the more people disconnect, like it creates a downward spiral. They're trying to create a winning culture. They're trying to win in the marketplace. They are trying to create a great place for people to work. They care. They're like at the front of the Peloton working really hard, and they're maybe over engaged, which creates a whole set of problems. And then we talked about what this looks like for the contributor who is confused and frustrated, and I can't figure out how to get an on ramp to this whole work thing, and I'm not sure if this is going to help me or hurt me, and I feel like I can't win at this game. I don't know how to win, and we know this. We know that when people are engaged in a pursuit, we'll call it a game, and they can't win structurally, systematically, they don't try harder. They tend to fall back. We know this from pace setters in multipliers, is that when people can't keep up, they don't speed up, they just watch and they disengage.
Yeah, hopelessness sets in and all the emotions that come with that.
So hopefully we're not going to spend any more time trying to like unpack this and figure out what's going on. What we want to do in this session is like, what do you do about it? What do you do when you are in the middle trying to hold this together, trying to close this wound, and there's not enough. There's not enough material.
So what we're going to do is we're going to take it in two steps. The first part we're going to do is we're going to spend time thinking about leadership practices managing up, and what can you do. There's loads of experience with this in terms of kind of really working with your senior leaders in a way that's productive and can put you in a situation where you can really influence the equation. And then we're going to take a look at what can you do coaching rising talent. So let's jump first into this this bit on, okay, what are the leadership practices to kind of close the gap as we look up?
Okay, before we go right into practices, I think like all of the work we do, we start with the beliefs
Mm.
that generate the behavior and the mindsets that lead to really good outcomes. And I think this is a chance for us to look at what are mindsets that really can help us act appropriately. And I think, you alluded to this at the end of our last conversation. It's like, you know what? It might be hard to be in the middle right now, but never has there been a time.
Yeah.
You said it so well. It was like, never has there been a time where managers can have more positive impact on people's work experience and maybe on their whole lives.
Mm-hmm.
Like, this is actually a time where, as a leader, like, you really matter. And the way that you close this gap and respond to people really matters and really has the potential to shape people's lives. Um, I think having this mindset of like, my job is like, maybe even more than to be a coach, is my job is to be a counselor
Mm-hmm.
and to help people like find an on-ramp to the path of a healthy, productive work life.
Mm-hmm.
I think when we manage our teams, that's the mindset we need to come to it with. And then I think as we're managing up, I think there's a helpful mindset there. Middle management, so many people here who are gathered are in the learning and development space, and they know like the middle management space has always been the difficult one to architect curriculum for. They're kind of like the forgotten levels of management. They kind of get left feeling like blamed and helpless in many ways. And we've often thought of this middle management job as a translator job. Like, my job is to pay attention to what's happening, what the senior leaders want, and to translate that into action.
Mm-hmm.
And it has been this translation job. But I think the job is changing, and it's moving from one of translation to one of connection.
Mm-hmm.
Like, my job here is to connect the dots, but also to connect people
Yeah.
to each other, to
Yeah.
connect people to, our vision, to like help people connect to like different perspectives. And I actually think that's an exciting job,
Yeah.
to be the connective tissue that makes it all work.
I was just speaking with a chief of staff for senior executive at Adobe yesterday, and she was commenting to me on that. I was asking her, like, what's changing about your job as you support leaders, and interviewing her to kind of just find out like the shifts that have occurred, especially since the pandemic. And she said, one of the things that struck me is I find myself over and over and over again in these last few years recognizing that people are feeling disconnected, and that the real job that I have now that I didn't think about consciously is, first I ask, as we're helping with mergers and acquisitions and getting teams on the same page, is, do these people feel connected to this team? Do they feel connected to the company? Do they feel connected to the vision? And what she found is that the answer is no for the most part, and that she's having to slow things down, really work on how do you connect a team in a way where they do feel like a sense of not just camaraderie, but that they kind of share values, share beliefs, that they're even together, that they're even on the same damn bus. Like, people feel like that they are off and kind of lost, so it's exactly what you're saying. She's like, I'm becoming kind of like my full-time job is really to connect people, and then once they're connected, to connect them to a greater mission.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's a noble job. And, while you were talking about that, I got like remembering what my job was like in my nuclear family when my father, was ill and before he passed. And, he's living alone. And, we know we're also leading in a loneliness
Yeah.
epidemic. And I felt like so much of my job, it was more than just translating, here's what the doctors are saying, and here's the pills you're supposed to take. It was helping him feel connected
Mm-hmm.
to something, and like just making those phone calls like, hey, Dad, how are you? And just making sure that he felt like there was something he could count on. And I loved that role. And I think managers have an opportunity to play this role. Connectors. Um, So let's talk about managing up. And I want to share a few practices, and we're going to ask everyone. And so maybe I should start now. We're going to ask everyone to weigh in on when you are managing up. And let's kind of make this very specific. You are managing where you can't easily or naturally, or even in a like a sane way, meet the expectations of senior leaders.
Mm-hmm.
Like where you feel like you are set up to fail. What they want, you can't really do, and the team can't do. There's a gap. How do you do that? So why don't we start chatting
Yep.
that in now? Lauren's going to be watching this. We've changed our setup here so we can better see chat. Like, how do you deal with unreasonable expectations so that you don't look like the one who's like, yeah, we can't do that. We can't do that either. Nope, sorry, not willing to. I want to share a few practices. And maybe the very best practice I learned by watching like my favorite boss. I probably don't spend enough time talking about Phil Wilson and what an incredible multiplier he was to me. He was my boss at Oracle for a number of years. He was the senior vice president of human resources. So he ran human resources for the company. You know, they're like a $30 billion company at the time. Phil was a former professor of literature at Princeton. So he was this great leader.
He's a thinker.
He's a thinker. And he is this like noble human being. He is a good person through and through and just absolutely brilliant. He ended up shifting his career and going into HR. Now, in his work in HR, I think he started that at Princeton, but then he got recruited and worked for 2 companies and 2 bosses. And this is who this lovely man worked for. His first boss was Steve Jobs at Next.
Okay.
So he was the head of HR at Next.
And there was a little bit of an edge on Steve when he was at Next.
Edgy.
A little extra edge.
Yeah, no, he's coming out of the wilderness. He's got something to prove. He's trying to build something great. And then his next boss was Larry Ellison at Oracle. And so these are 2 strong-willed, mercurial, hot-headed, like demanding kinds of leaders. And there was something Phil said to me that I will forever remember. He said, yeah, when I find myself in a position where I'm asked to do something unreasonable, he said, I just have learned the yes and technique. And he said, I always say yes to them. But like we know that if you are always saying yes to senior leaders, like you get walked on and you end up dragging your team through the thicket, you know, and they're injured by all of these yeses. He says, I always start with yes, but then I insert an and.
So like, for example, Steve comes in and says, I'm so frustrated with all these people. I want to fire this whole team.
This was the example Phil gave me. You know, sometimes they would say something unreasonable, like, I want to hire the entire graduating class of MIT. Like, how do we do that?
Yeah.
But then it would often be things like, I hate that product. That product sucks. Like, get rid of all these people.
Yeah.
And that probably came from both Steve and Larry at different points in time. He's like, I want to fire them all. Like, can you fire them this week?
Yeah.
And so Phil would respond with, like, I totally get like the frustration. Yes, we can do that. And then the executive would calm down and he would say, and like, if we do this, here's what's likely to happen. Like, we're probably going to look at, you know, wrongful termination suits. And like, Larry, you're probably going to need to plan for spending a week out of each month over the next 6 months in lawsuit. And, you know, you're going to need a lot of court time, but we can do that. And so it was always this yes and he said inevitably logic prevailed in this, and they ended up doing something more reasonable. And I think this yes and that I learned from Phil highlights, I think, 2 really good practices for managing up. The first is to side with them and to let them know, like, I am here. I am working for you. I understand what you need, and I am on your side. I'm not fighting you. And particularly if you have strong-willed executives who are asking
in a way,
for
you're giving them the
things.
floor. Let it all out, man. I want to hear it. So they know you've got that. You've heard what they've had to say. You were even encouraging them to kind of unload the fullness of this wrath that they're feeling.
yes, we can do that. I remember once talking to the founder and CEO of a really big unicorn tech company, really, really successful company. It's a company that, everyone here probably uses their technology. And I remember him telling me, it was kind of a coaching situation. And he was telling me about two different people who worked for him. And one was a yes person, and the other was like a, I don't know,
Like,
boss. Like
yeah.
that seems crazy because
Immediate,
do crazy things.
skepticism.
Yeah, and he just like his whole energy changed around the person who was like, "That's a fun idea, let's do it." And so you need both types. And this CEO, he acknowledged, like, yeah, I need this other guy who's kind of a bummer, but he's sort of a bummer. And I think like the posture to take is both of those.
Yeah.
And so it's siding with the senior leader, like, I got you. But then it's spotting.
Yeah.
And it's spotting the problems and things that could go wrong. Now, as I was thinking about this, I'm like, ooh, citing, particularly for those who work in HR, one of the issues right now in the HR communities, a lot of employees are like, hey, HR sucks. HR sucks because they always are taking the side of senior leadership. And so we have to be careful about citing. But I think the point I want to make is you can take both sides. Now, I brought something, Sean. Just as I was before I was coming over here, I brought a piece of fabric with a great big hole in it. So you probably know this about me. Maybe some people know it. I sew. I like to sew. If you've read Impact Players, you know that I'm a really good sewer, really good seamstress, and a really bad ironer. Like I don't iron well, but I sew well. And so my kids are constantly coming to me. And in particular, my son, Christian, he'll always come to me. Every article of clothing he has gets ripped. Now, sometimes those rips are at the seams where it's really easy to sew that up. And for those of you who've mended, it's pretty easy. You just go in and reestablish that seam. But it's very different when they come to you and they're like, hey, mom, like I ripped this, can you fix it? Where you're like, well, that's a very different kind of a rip because like there's no seam allowance. Like there's no way to sew that up and have it be restored to its place. Like if the fabric's got to come, the fabric to support that seam has got to come from somewhere. And, in these situations, I've learned that the way you do it is you've got to like back it. And so you've got to take and put something behind it. Now, I don't know if any of this is visible, but I've got like this white, sturdy piece of fabric. And then you sew it here and then you sew it there and it creates strength on both sides and it holds this thing together. And as I was thinking about this, like I've learned, like you've got to back it and connect it and you've got to fix it, that create that fixation on both sides. And I think that's what you have to do when you are stuck in the middle and you can't close this gap. You have to establish, I am equally on both sides and I am holding this thing together. So number one, side with that senior executive, help spot problems. And the other thing that I've learned is you can practice the shift. And this really looks like, I understand what you're trying to do, and I can't do this. Like if they're asking you to do something very specific, hey, I want you to, pull together a leadership conference like next month. Well, okay, like I can't do that. We don't have enough runway to do that, but I can do this. And Sean, as you and I were talking about this, you reminded me of a conversation we had with one of our clients. And this is what, 7 years ago after you had joined the team. And you said there was something I did that was kind of really smart in that situation. I can assure you it was total desperation.
Well,
do you remember that?
Yeah, because so we were meeting with the CEO, the chief people officer, and another executive, and the CEO was this was a fast growing tech real estate company, extremely ambitious. They'd collected all the best talent you can imagine. They were here in Silicon Valley, and we went and met with them, and the CEO kind of laid out exactly what he wanted us to do and how he wanted us to approach it. And I remember thinking, oh, most of that stuff we don't do. And I thought to myself, look, is Liz going to pull like a rabbit out of her, hat? Is she going to just, I was really, I was just kind of,
you're like, this man, I get my popcorn. I'm watching this. Yeah.
And what was really interesting was you did a yes and it was, oh yeah, right. And spent time exploring from exactly what he wanted. And then there was this little pivot where I was like, well, of those things that you mentioned, let me share with you what, we don't do that as much, but you were straight with them, but you said, but let me tell you, of those things you said, this thing we do really well. And and he just pivoted right with us. I think he was almost even kind of feeling out, what can I get here? And so he just laid it all on the table. And then instead, 10 cards were laid down, but one card was picked up. And, obviously we did a really great project with them, and it made it, it was very successful. But I thought it was fantastic the way you handled it.
And it was desperation, but I think I've learned, because I've had some really demanding bosses in my career. It's like, I get what you're saying. It's like, I'm on your side. I can't do that specific thing, but I can do this. And, it's easy to get into like, well, we can't do that. Like, I don't have enough resources. I can't. But like, if you lay those out side by side, I find that most executives are like, okay, I'll take the thing you can do, because their job isn't to prescribe exactly how to do it.
Yeah.
It's to get the job done. And the more that we understand, like, here's the job to be done. Here's what's important now. I'm on your side. I can do that. It comes with consequences, but here's what I can do that is better for you. And that's what I have found. Now, I've noticed chat is populating, and because it is a complex question, we ask, like, how do you deal with, senior leaders when you can't meet their demands? The comments are long, but my guess is Lauren is on it. And she has been processing this. Like, Lauren, what are you seeing in this? And are there any that you want to call out or ask people to weigh in a little bit more about?
Liz, earlier you said that one way we can think about this like experience of middle managers is maybe thinking of them as connectors. And I feel like that paradigm is resonating a little bit with what we're seeing in the comments here. That we're seeing a lot of kind of how they can best play this role when they are connecting like person to person, talking about upward empathy, talking about making sure that they have these conversations like in person, being sincere, being transparent, and then connecting executives and business needs with the realities of people in this experience, like in ways that include granularity, in ways that are very straightforward and make it very clear, like, here's where we fall short and here's what we can do.
Yeah.
And there's thanks for that, Lauren. And there's a question here, which I think is a fun one. Candace Hatch asked this question: how can you avoid being perceived as difficult when you're skilled at identifying pitfalls and issues? Like, your brain is just, you're programmed to find the problems, see them, even communicate them.
Well, it's great. And then I like, my reaction to that, Candace, is like, to know that about yourself and to talk openly about it. Like, oh, my brain naturally goes to what's not going to work. So this is what I'm like, I'm going to come at you first with what can work. But then you've got to do the 2-step on this, because having worked with a lot of executives, they don't like it when people are constantly pointing out, here's what doesn't work. So you've got to couple that with, I'm on your side. Yes, I can do that. Here's what could go wrong. And then you've got to give them a replacement.
Yeah.
And so if you like own that skill, do it well, but try to find, like, always sit next to it. But here's what could work. Here's what I can do. And I think when we do that, people will appreciate what you point out, because that's what executives look to their staff to do, is like, don't let me step in this. Like, help me avoid this. Lauren, I really appreciated one of the things you said about, you talked about like one-on-one conversations, and that has come up here. And it just makes me think of like the difference in a very tense international crisis. Like, you could be the translator and just like communicate, okay, here's what this head of state said to that head of state. Or you could be more like the diplomat, which is like, you know what, let me have some one-on-one conversations and let me find something that can work. Let me see if I can find a win for this country, a win for this country. And that diplomacy role's got to be a lot more fun. it's harder.
Yep.
It's easy to just translate, oh, this is what the big bosses want. Okay,
Mhm.
so here should be our
Yeah.
goals. But it's not nearly as fun.
Yeah, there's one of the things that I've found is like to be a best practice that has over and over and over again, I've heard leaders say this works for them, and I've seen it in my own career, is the more, in some ways, you kind of have to know who you're working for. The more demand, if you work for Steve Jobs, you got to know you work for Steve Jobs. If you work for Larry Ellison, you've got to know, what does this mean? And to some degree, as you size up who you're working for, there's a real long, there's a long game here. And so I think that one of the best practices I've seen is upfront, you've got this two-step. Couldn't agree more. You need this two-step, especially when you know they're going to need you to two-step, or they won't be able to work with you. And then there's a second piece, which is I find it really helpful to just be coming back to the table regularly. What is it that this leader is trying to accomplish? What's their long-term goal? What are their short-term goals? How can I one-on-one meet with them on a regular basis and make sure that I'm staying current and updated with what it is that they see and what it is that they want? Because the clearer you are on that, I think it makes it easier for you to slow down in the moment. So when they show up and say that they want you to hire the entire class at MIT, you can place where this is coming from. But if you can't, I think it's easier to be a little more reactive, because you don't have the sense of where it's coming from. You don't have the sense of why that would matter to them. And so I think the underlying principle is like, know thyself and know thy boss.
Know your boss and affirm your boss. Like we talked about, one way to do that is to side. Like it's the yes, I can do that. Yes, I understand you. It's to be a little bit of a yes man in that situation. But there's some words, there's some magic words. Now I have, maybe a lot of people know that I have this colleague, Ben Putterman. I don't think I can write a book without some sort of Ben Putterman story. Ben worked for me for 10 years at Oracle. And there was something I noticed Ben said a lot. He said it to me, but he said it to other people as well. And they were magic words. And I want to give you these magic words. Well, first of all, he always called me boss, which I'm like, Ben, stop calling me boss. People are going to think I'm like, but he just was like, hey, boss. It was a little bit endearing. And because he was like, I get it. You're my boss. But he said all the time, I think you're right about that. So I would be like, I think we really need to do this. And he would just say, you know what? I think you're right about that. And then he would go on to add to that, oftentimes disagreeing with it or adding a different perspective or spotlighting a problem. And it didn't matter that he was negating it in some ways. He was acknowledging, like, I think you might be right about that, or I think you're right. And so I would always calm down and just listen to what he wanted to add or shift or change. And I think they're magic words. Like, you know what? I think you're right. Like, you know what? We need to get our unfair share of the MIT graduating class. You're right about that. But it's saying to your boss, you're right about that. And I think it actually is, I don't see this as a managing up process, a kiss up. I don't see this as political. I see it more as a multiplier practice of acknowledging where people have good ideas.
Yeah.
And when they hear that, it's like pheromones that just signal, be calm. Let's have a calm conversation. So use a little bit of Ben Putterman and just like, you know what? I think you're right. I think you're right about that. Okay, let's talk about how we lead the rising generation and some of those leadership practices.
Yeah, and here's how we're going to frame this. We've been doing some work on just kind of thinking through, for the people that are engaging in the workforce, what do they really want? What does, what does a great work life look like for them? And so what I'd love to do is Lauren, do you have a chart that we can share, or was I going to share that? Do we have that?
Well, we need to phone a nerd.
Okay,
and we've been trying to understand, how do people define what a great work life is? It used to be sort of monolithic, but it's changing, and people have very different values that are surfacing as they're redefining. So we've been doing some analysis trying to understand what's important to people and what shapes a great work life. And Lauren has been out getting intel on that. What do you got for us?
Thanks. So for everyone who may not be familiar with all the ins and outs of what I do, my absolute favorite part of my job is whenever we kind of stumble upon a question or we find something and decide like, hey, this is a really important question and we don't know the answer to it. And it's time for us to design some way to get at that. And one of these things that we've been wrestling with a bit lately is this question: what makes a great work life? And we phrased it this way really intentionally, not just what makes work life tolerable for people, what makes a work life that is not like actively harmful, but really like what makes your work life great. So we started by just asking this question of ourselves and of a lot of other people we knew, of people we came into contact with, like what are the components of, what are the ingredients for a really great work life? And I would love to have you all start in the chat, like throwing out what are some of these elements of a great work life for you? What is it all about? But we started collecting these answers from people. We cast a really broad net and we got so many responses. We started sifting through those and seeing what the themes were, what things were coming up a lot, what things seemed to be like pretty comparable items. And we came up with a list of about 30 really frequently referenced great work life elements. And then we took it to a survey. We shared, these are some of those elements. It's not the full list that we asked about in a survey, but we surveyed several hundred people so far about what makes a great work life for them. And just for reference, this population is like pretty representative of the US workforce. We haven't really taken it international yet, but we have a range of ages, a range of races. I think the median age on this was about 36, but we really have a spread here. And we asked them about each item. First, we asked them, like, how important is this to you? Is it very important? Is it not very important? They had kind of a scale they could answer on. And then we asked them to pick, like, what are the most important things? Like, if you can only choose 3, what are your top 3 elements of a great work life? So as you skim through this, start thinking about what are those elements for you? Which of these might be the most important to you? And like I said, this wasn't our full list. These are in no particular order, but they are actually what we found to be the top 10 out of our recent survey. And I think Austin has a poll loaded up. Austin, would you go ahead and start that poll? And you might need to scroll down within the poll window here, but go ahead and choose up to 3 of these items. What's really important to you to have a great work life? We'll spend just a minute here so that
And Lauren, as
anyone
people
who
are
wants to
doing
has a
this,
chance to participate.
yeah, and as people are populating that, we're asking people what people value in their work life. I know a lot of organizations have taken like these value initiatives, like, hey, what do you value? But it's kind of like, what do you value in life?
Mm-hmm.
And what we're doing is something a lot more targeted, which is, what do you value about your work life? Like, what makes work a great experience rather than a sucky experience? And one of the things we're going to see here as we look at this is that as a leader, if you can understand this, like if you understand people's like life values, like you can maybe help guide them to this, but this is far more concrete. Is as a team, you can understand what people want from work, then you can do things to help shape that and help connect the dots between, here's a set of good professional practices and leadership practices, and it's how you get what you want rather than what the bosses want, which is what a lot of people seem to be allergic to right now, is like, I don't want to do it just because the boss wants it. This is helping people get what they want. Okay, what are we seeing in this?
Yeah. All right. Let's give it maybe 10 more seconds for anyone who has a couple more clicks to make.
And I see some people are putting theirs into chat, which I think is great. We just did this recently as a team, and I'm like, oh, I've learned some things about my teammates, like what's really important to them to create a great work experience. You could do the same thing with your teams.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and end this poll. And I guess first, let's take a look here at this is what we found from this recent survey. We don't expect this to be the same as our Leadership Matters community here. It might be different at every company. It'll be different depending on the makeup of a group. But what our survey found was that these were some of the top items that people listed as like a top 3 great work-life factor for them. Having a healthy work-life balance, maximizing their earnings, working on what they're passionate about. And let's go ahead and take a look at what we see here. Looks like some of the highest for us in this group, having a healthy work-life balance. Is that the absolute highest? Oh no, working in a positive culture, just narrowly beat out the work-life balance here, as well as being a part of a great team,
Which doesn't
meaningful
surprise
impact on the
me
world.
because this group is a group that is so committed to creating a positive work culture. These are like the
Absolutely.
ambassadors and architects of positive work culture.
Yeah, absolutely. No, it's so fun to see this and to like I said, this is one of the things I really love about my work, and it's fun to kind of get to have you all come along with us on it.
Yeah,
It's been
so Lauren,
interesting to take a look at this, but one of the biggest takeaways for me has been that not only is everybody choosing different things, this looks a little different for every person. It's not a one size fits all, single faceted situation. But what we did find is that in our survey, there are certain items that most people rated really highly. Most people said it's really important to have a job that supports good mental health. Most people said it's really important to them to have a healthy work-life balance, to have a positive workplace. All of these things rated very highly. But when we asked people to pick just 3, what we saw is that people were looking for some balance. They were looking for, very few people chose all 3 of their top 3 items as like maybe a wellness oriented item. Very few people chose all 3 as like a flexibility or autonomy oriented item. Very few people chose all 3 to be about achievement and progression. A lot of people were kind of saying, no, I want some of this. I need balance. And I also want some flexibility with where I work. I want to have good mental health. I want my job to support that. And I also want to love what I'm doing. So I think it's a thing that we're working with that is tricky, but I think it can also be so helpful to put a name on it.
And thank you, Lauren. And Andy asked this good question: is that choice impacted by life stages? And we haven't yet cut the data that way, and we're going to do a large sample on this. But I think we will see that shift. And I guess what our first recommendation is, when you are managing, and we're managing in this environment where people feel where there's a commitment gap, there's like not enough fabric here to close this. And people are redefining their relationship to work. Like, we as leaders can be guidance counselors to the people who work on our team. And it starts with, and I really like this metaphor of like high school guidance counselor who's like, okay, so what do you want out of your high school experience? Like, do you want to go to college? Where do you want to go to college? And then they're helping you choose the classes that are going to get you on the path that you want. And, a good guidance counselor, unless maybe you work at a really elite high school, like college prep, doesn't assume that everyone wants to like go through some track to get to some Ivy League school. It's like, let me find out what you want and help you choose the path and the actions that are going to get you there. And I think as managers, we need to assume not everyone wants the same things out of work, and it's changing rapidly. So what we can do is start the conversation of like, of this list of things, like what's most important to you at work, and then share with people how you get that. Now, I want to step aside for just a moment. Like, we've received interesting feedback from the Impact Players book, and one of like we get a lot of people are like, yes, these are the practices that lead to impact, that lead to success. This is what I need in my company. And it's a book that senior leaders love. And most like learning and development and talent development people love. But we get this little pocket of feedback from the contributors who are like, yeah, no, because you're just asking me to work harder. You're asking me to do more. You're asking me to like magnify my job. And I'm not sure I even like the whole work thing. And so it leaves managers in this really tough bind of like, I can't ask people to do the things that I know are going to help them find success. But if you add to that a diagnostic of really understanding what's important to that person, you can help guide them to the practices that are going to get there. We put together a little infographic that kind of sums up, shows like those impact player practices in context of helping people achieve a great work life. And this first image is the whole thing, but I want to break it into its three component parts. And, what are the practices? So if you jump to that yellow part visually, is like, hey, don't just do your job, do the job that's needed. And people are like, ugh, that just seems like you're asking me to do double duty and somebody else's job. But when you can say, like, if what's important to you is you want to do meaningful work doesn't usually come packaged neatly in a job. It's usually messy kind of work. And like, if that's important to you to do meaningful work and you want to avoid like working in a black hole where your work isn't seen and appreciated, you don't feel seen or heard, then it's important to be willing to step outside of that. You'll be seen as someone who's making a difference. Like when we start from what people fundamentally want, these practices make a lot more sense. Maybe we'll go through another one. And Sean, why don't you talk us through this one?
Well, a lot of times what we're wanting as a contributor, especially if we're ambitious, is we want to grow into a leadership position. I'm speaking to a large group of high potentials tomorrow. And as we look at the survey data and what they really want, top on their list was, I want to be influential. I want to get promoted into leadership. But you want to avoid getting stuck in this kind of ladder where you're just waiting to be called on and called up, then the question is how can you then take charge of a situation where you can see that there's no one that's stepping up and taking ownership for it? So there's a leadership vacuum. And so if you can learn how to identify where the leadership vacuums are, then you don't need to wait to be called up to be a leader. You can just step into being a leader right now. And so, I think what this does is it scratches an itch, and it also broadcasts prior to, like, for your dress rehearsal, that you're actually already ready for the stage performance.
Absolutely. And I think what's important about this is it's helping people work with high impact practices that serve them rather than serve the organization. We're getting more and more data that says like the rising generation of workers don't want to serve an organization. They don't want to work for a big organization. They don't want to work in a traditional job. So how do we help serve them? And this does this. It also, like, very few people, and I say this as someone who loves like putting together these books, like very few people want to be handed a book and say, you need to do this. Like, you need to be a multiplier. Here's 37 practices.
You might as well handed me a velvet hammer.
Exactly. Or like, hey, I want you to read this impact players book. And like, I want you to do this stuff. Like, it doesn't help someone to give them 37 things. But if you say, like, this is important to you, you want to be able to control like your work and have autonomy. Well, then if you want that, then you've got to make sure you get things all the way done, because you'll build this reputation as someone who gets it done. And then you can set your schedules and you can set your time and you can work from anywhere you want. Oh, okay, I'm now interested. So it's about them, and it's just targeting the practice that will help them get what they want and build a great work life. So that's kind of like our first suggestion for how you help people find an on-ramp to the kind of practices will help them be a stellar contributor and leader inside an organization. Oh, we've got 5 minutes left.
Yeah. So, well, let's assess. Of the things that we have left, Liz, what do you think might be the most useful as we look at coaching the rising talent generation?
Well, why don't we talk about just the importance of helping people get on a cycle of success? And then just a quick thought about how do you set the level of challenge right so that people win?
Mhm.
They're like two simple concepts and practices. Let's do 2 minutes on each.
Yeah. Okay. I'll do one on the cycle of success. One of the simplest things I've ever experienced is to have a leader formalize the feedback process from a team standpoint. So you look at failures just like a football team. The coach gets everybody together a couple days after the game. Everybody watches the film. You write down a few things that we want to work on. But there's what we want is consistent, structured feedback that gives us the ability to focus on one thing. This is so important because so often, especially for people that aren't too sure about themselves and their position and they're wanting to grow, if they don't know where they should be placing their weight, then it makes it really hard to know how to step.
Yeah, people don't know what to do with a feedback dump or gaps that are too big.
Yeah. So there's this formalizing a regular process where it's consistent and people know it's coming to look at failures, mistakes, pivots. So that way, both the consistency and the structure, and then the clarity of what comes out of that, it creates this environment where you just feel like that you are on a growing, performing team.
I remember you telling me about a coach you had who just every week gave you a small
One thing.
correction.
Yep.
And you started to know it was coming and like, okay, I'm going to be asked to do one thing differently. And it was just bite sized and you can work on it. And you started to get really good
Yeah, I only
at
had
the game.
Yeah, what he did for the entire team was we only ever had one thing that we were supposed to work on. But through a season, I mean, the growth was phenomenal. But that's what film was about. It was about figuring out what's the one thing that you need to work on for the next week. Of course, you're working on many other things.
Yeah. And so we've got a graphic that we've used in a lot of our work, which is like the difference between a failure to launch process, which is to start out with a big ambition. And everyone here who architects learning process knows what happened when people like go big, aspire big. I want to do this. And you're trying to rise to meet those expectations. It tends to lead to a hype cycle, a failure, a relaunch to a give up kind of process versus like little iterative wins that start to build this confidence and this cycle. And I want to go back to like where we started this conversation, where people who are entering work, like they don't know, they're like suspicious of work. And I think some of that is, I just don't know how to win at this game.
Yeah.
And we can help people win at this game by structuring a series of really small wins. Which kind of brings us to, I think the final practice that we have time for is it's one of the multiplier practices, and it's about sizing the challenge right. Like we know that when people back away from challenge, when work is rote, when it's easy, when it's in our wheelhouse, we are not at our best. We tend to be at our best when we have this healthy level of stretch. This is a research we that I did for Wiki Smarts, and we asked people. This is a survey of about 1,000 people. Like, what's the degree of challenge in your work, and then what's your satisfaction at work? And what we found was this like near perfect linear correlation that as challenge level goes up, so does job satisfaction. People engage, they feel connected, they're getting those little dopamine hits of like, I did something, it worked. Okay, I'd like to do more. But just creating big challenges for people will spawn a cycle of failure, a failure to launch. And so one of the
Especially for a workforce that's already not sure if they're into work that way.
And work is going to injure me and it's going to jeopardize my mental health. So like we have to, the sizing of challenge, I think, becomes one of the master skills of leaders.
Just right.
How do you get this tension right where it's just hard enough that there's growth and challenge, but easy enough that people are willing to lean in? I guess the last chat question that we would maybe like flood us with some intel on this is, how do you know as a leader when you've sized the challenge right? Like,
Mhm.
what do you see in people's eyes? What are the indicators? How do you know you've got that level of tension just right? And particularly with an eye towards people who are newer to work and maybe a little hesitant
Mhm.
to lean all the way in. So why don't we fill chat with that?
How do you know?
And there's lots more we could talk about, but we're out of time. Sean, as people are filling that up, oh, I can't resist. There's a couple here. Tom says they're engaged and they feel like they're learning.
Mhm.
Um, I see intrigue.
Mhm.
Like the lights are going on and they're asking questions to understand better. Okay, what are other things? There's some comments about, will you send the graphs? Of course, we will send the graphs. You see energy. Heather, thank you for that. Energy starts to increase. So I think this is one of the most important things we can do. Find out what's important to people, guide them to 1 or 2 practices, start a cycle of success, and get those challenges sized just right. Maybe even erring on within reach.
Thanks,
Okay.
Liz. Hey, listen, it's been, as always, very fun to be with you all and insightful. Thank you for your participation in the chat. We'll be joining you again in a month. We'll be reaching out to you to get problems that you would like to spend some time on with us. So if you can think of a leadership challenge that you're grappling with that's would be meaningful for us to be able to spend some time, as we send this email out, please fill it out. It's been fantastic. Thank you again for wherever you are in the world. Have a wonderful day for the rest of your day and week. And until next time.
Thank you. And there's really good comments here in chat. So if you can stay long enough to see all the insights.
And we'll post the chat. We'll make sure that we capture it all here.
Thanks for being with us.